Robin Hood, Chapter 1, How Robin Hood Became an Outlaw. Long, long ago, in the days when Henry II, first of Plantagenet kings, was seated on the throne of England, a youth was walking swiftly through the forest of Sherwood. He was a tall, strong, comely lad, wearing a woodland dress of green jerkin and hose, and a blue cap or hood on his head. At his shoulder swung a longbow of great strength. At his side was his sheaf of cloth-yard arrows, and hanging at his girdle was a short wood knife. The forest glade through which he strode was lined by huge oaks, and once he stood still to watch a herd of antlered deer sweep by in swift and graceful flight. One hand went to his bow, the other to his quiver, but he restrained himself and forbore to lay an arrow on the string, for he knew that he was in a royal forest. These were the king's deer, and to slay one was as much, nay, more, than a man's life was worth. More than a man's life, that seems a hard saying, but it is a true one. In those days, when one who killed a deer in a royal preserve had his eyes torn out, and was mutilated in so dreadful a fashion that death would have been preferable. The tall lad knew this very well, but another reason also caused him to stay his hand. He was on his way to Nottingham, hoping to enter the king's service as a forester, and it would ill become one with his hopes to lay a hand on the royal deer. He strode on, left the glade, and was crossing a piece of greensward, dotted by thickets of holly and coppices of hazelwood, when he was hailed by a harsh voice. "Stand!" it cried. "Who art thou to march boldly through the king's greenwood?" The lad turned and saw a group of 5 or 6 figures beneath the shadow of a wide-spreading holly bush. All were seated on the ground save one, and he was the speaker. At a glance, the youth knew them for a band of the king's foresters, men who guarded the royal preserve and the deer, and he saluted them with a motion of respect. Then he replied to the man who had accosted him, a man whose silver bugle horn showed that he was the chief forester. "My name," said the tall lad, "is Robert Fitzooth, though many people call me Robin Hood. My parents are dead, and I am going to Nottingham." "And why goest thou there?" "I hope to become one of the king's foresters." The man laughed scornfully. "Easier said than done," he growled. "Every landless man and masterless rogue longs to join our goodly company. Of what use to us would be such a stripling as thou art? We want a man, but thou hast not save a man's bow." "'Tis more than a man's bow," cried another forester. "Look at the strength of it. I trow that slip of a lad can never draw it." "Draw it?" jeered the chief forester. "Not likely. He does but carry it for vain pretense." Robin's bright eye flashed, and his fresh face colored. "I will draw it to a mark with any man among you," he cried. "And what will you wager?" said the chief forester. "I have no money," cried the fiery lad, "but I will lay my head against your purse that I hit any target you choose." "Done!" cried the forester angrily. "There's your target." He pointed across the greensward to the mouth of a distant glade. A herd of deer had swept into view and paused at sight of the men. They were led by a splendid hart, who now flung up his antlered head, snuffing the air and striking the ground impatiently with one forefoot. Robin Hood said nothing, but took his bow, tightened his string, and chose an arrow from his quiver. Then he laid his body into the bow in such fashion that the foresters knew that here was no common archer, either in point of skill or strength or skill. The great bow bent and taunted amid murmurs of wonder from the onlookers. Then Robin showed that he had nerve as well as great strength and skill. Just as he was drawing the steel head to the bow shaft, the chief forester cried out suddenly, "'Tis your head you wager. Bethink thyself of that, my young friend." This was done to shake and disturb Robin, just as he hung on his aim, but it failed. To all appearance the lad had heard nothing. His keen eye was glancing along the shaft. His brow was slightly furrowed in calculating thought. His lips were set firm. Then twang, sang the bowstring, and the arrow hummed through the air like a great bee. At the next instant, the great beast made a leap into the air and dropped on his side, dead, the shaft through his heart. For an instant the foresters were dumb with amazement at the wonderful shot. Then murmurs of wonder arose. Robin turned quietly to the chief forester. "I have won the purse," he said. But the man smiled an evil smile. "I will tell thee what thou hast won," he said jeeringly. "Thou hast won the pains and penalties of the forest laws. Yon was a king's hart royal, and so good a bowman as thou art must well know what it means for a man to slay a deer in the royal forest. Seize him and bind him, my men." Robin saw the fearful danger into which this hasty acceptance of the target had led him, and turned to fly. Too late. A couple of foresters had already sprung on him. He was tripped up and borne to the earth, and in a trice his feet and hands were lashed together with bowstrings. "Now we have a deer-killing rascal taken red-handed," chuckled the chief forester. "Twice or thrice of late the sheriff hath complained to me that deer be stolen from the coverts, and yet we bring no rogue to be charged with the theft. This day we can content him." Robin's blood ran cold as he heard these words. The treacherous villain had drawn him into the trap of shooting the deer, and now meant to give him up in cold blood as a common deer-slayer, and to pretend that his capture was a proof of the keeper's vigilance. The forester's speech was hailed with shouts of applause from his underlings. "Ay," cried one, "and let us take him in as such a knave should be carried." "How, Hubert?" demanded the chief forester. "Why, bound in the hide of the deer he hath slain," cried Hubert. "Good," cried his leader. "Off with the hide, lads, and tie the rogue in it." The knives of the foresters made short work of stripping off the skin of the deer, and within a short time Robin was wrapped in the hot, greasy hide, the latter lashed across with spare bowstrings. The lad's head was thrust through an opening where the deer's neck had been, but of the rest of him there was but a shapeless bundle, enclosed in the soft dapple fur which had so lately clothed the great stag. Robin's heart was bursting with rage and scorn for these mean traitors, but he was helpless, and the future was very black. The Norman sheriff would never listen to a word that he might say. It was clear that an example was needed, and that he was to furnish it, and the picture rose before his eyes of the market-place of Nottingham, and himself under the hands of the hangman who would carry out the dread sentence of the law. He had once seen a poor fellow suffer for this very offense that he was charged with, and he writhed again in agony to think that the punishment now hung over him. To hobble about for life, blind and a cripple, he who was now so young and strong, was too frightful to a fate to dwell upon, and he twisted and turned in his bonds and struggled to get free. But every effort was in vain. He was bound too securely for that. "How shall we carry the knave in?" cried one of the rangers. "Marry, but I have just thought of that, Dickon," replied the chief forester. "Did we not see 2 or 3 Saxon hinds, laborers, cutting wood a short half-mile from here as we came along? List, we can hear them now." There was a silence among the band, and the sound of axes rang from a distance. "Run, Dickon," said the leader to the man, who had spoken, and bring them hither with the sled they had with them for dragging home the logs. Away went Dickon, and in a short time he returned with the woodmen and their sled. "Take up this knave," commanded the chief forester. "Fling him on your sled and drag him before us to the town." The woodmen were 3 in number, and 2 hastened to obey, the third following more reluctantly. All 3 belonged to the poorest class of workers, and were dressed rudely in jerkins made of cowhide, with sandals and leggings of the same material, and no head covering on their matted shocks of hair. 2 were old men, and these were swift to obey the command of the forest tyrants whom they feared. The third was a strongly built, square-shouldered fellow of some 30 years of age, who, as has been said, moved more slowly to obey the command. Among them, however, Robin was taken up and swung onto the sled, a framework of planks set on 2 wooden runners, and the latter shaped from pieces of ash, which curved up naturally toward the fore part. Then the 3 hinds seized the ropes with which the sled was drawn along, and the rude carriage slid easily across the short, crisp grass. Within a half-mile they gained a rutted track, along which they turned, and now the sled bumped and jumped and tossed the deer-hide bundle, with its human contents, from side to side. Robin was not flung completely off, because a row of posts stood up on either side of the sled to prevent a burden being dislodged, but he was banged and bumped from side to side, utterly unable to help himself, while the brutal foresters roared with laughter at the hopeless plight of their captive. The hide, too, was cramping Robin's limbs in dreadful fashion, and as it drew tighter moment by moment, he could have cried out in agony, but he shut his teeth and maintained silence, knowing that his groans would be music to the ears of his brutal captors. Suddenly the chorus of the jolting sled was interrupted. The chief forester sprang forward and brought his bow-stave down with tremendous force across the shoulders of the young woodman. "Ha, knave," he cried, "thou dost not pull with a will. What wouldst thou show thy Saxon sullenness to us, the keepers of the forest?" And he rained a shower of blows on the man's head and shoulders. The woodman's hand dropped to the handle of the short, broad-bladed knife thrust in his girdle, but at a cry from one of the old men he withdrew it and pulled as if he had been a horse which had felt the urging lash. "Will, lad," cried the old man in trembling tone. "Pull, pull, anger not the forester." Old man, you speak sooth," said the tyrant, with a savage laugh. "That advice is good, indeed. 'Twere well that Will should not anger the forester. Pull, Will, pull, dog of a Saxon." And the forester laid 6 hearty blows again on the young woodman. Beneath the fell of matted hair, the Saxon's eyes gleamed redly, but he bent his head to the storm and pulled with a will in the most humble and obedient fashion. Presently a turn of the way brought them to a small hamlet of 6 huts, and the largest of the houses being decorated with a bush hanging before the door. A tavern, cried Hubert. "What say you to a halt here, comrades? I trow I could empty a flagon after our long walk through the forest." The others were of his opinion, and the sled came to a stand at the door of the little inn, while the foresters called for wine. As they stood there drinking, one of them suddenly raised a great shout. "Look," he cried, "yonder comes a band of our comrades, and see whom they have taken." Through the trees 5 more foresters were approaching the hamlet, and among them marched 2 men with hands bound and ropes fastened to their arms. "Good, good," cried the chief foresters in delight. "They have seized 2 of the outlaws who lurk in the forest. What with yonder rogues and the young scamp we have seized, the sheriff will be heartily content. Bravely done, lads. How did ye seize them?" Eager to hear how the outlaws had been taken, the chief forester and his men swarmed forward to meet the newcomers. They did not fear the escape of Robin Hood, lashed tightly in his wrapping of deerskin, and they did not dream that the Saxon woodmen would dare to make a movement without their permission. Yet it was the old man who had called upon the younger woodmen to be patient who was the first to flee. When he saw the foresters turn aside, he dropped his rope and fled softly away on his sandaled feet, like a dog that runs from the lash. He sprang into a narrow passage between two huts and vanished. The second old man saw nothing of this. His back was turned to his comrade, and he stood stupidly gazing on the crowd of foresters as they called to each other, laughing and talking, and some of the newcomers drinking from the flagons held out to them. The young woodman, Will, made at first as if to follow his older companion, then cast a glance at the sled. Robin said nothing, lest he should call the attention of the foresters, but his imploring eyes spoke for him. In reply, Will dropped on one knee beside the sled, whipped out his broad sharp knife, and slashed the bowstrings through with a few swift sweeps of the keen blade. Robin was free. His bow and arrows had been laid beside him on the sled to be brought in witness against him before the sheriff, but now he caught them up, shot between two of the upright posts, and leapt after Will, who was dashing into the narrow passage between the huts. "Hob, Hob," called the Will as he ran. "After us, man, after us." Hob was the third woodman, the old fellow who stood gazing like an ox at the meeting of the foresters. The warning cry drew his attention, and he looked round with a slow gape of wonder to see his comrades in flight. Unhappily, the voice of Will had caught his ears for which he was not intended. The voice of Will had caught ears for which it was not intended. The chief forester whirled on his heel and gave a yell of anger at the sight which met his gaze. "The knaves are fleeing," he roared in a voice of thunder, "and they have freed the captive. Back, lads, and seize them, alive or dead." He clapped an arrow on his bow as he spoke, and drew the string to his ear. Hob was now lumbering after his friends, for at least his slow-moving wits had grasped the fact that a flight to the forest was the safest thing for him. But the gray goose shaft was too swift by far. It hummed after him with the tremendous speed of an arrow just leaving the bow, struck him squarely between the shoulders, and he pitched forward on his face and lay still, the gray goose shaft quivering as it stood upright from his back. When Robin ran through the narrow passage between the houses, he came to a small courtyard, over the further wall of which Will the woodman was already climbing. The old man had completely disappeared. Robin bounded across the little courtyard, put his foot on a crossbar of the wooden paling which formed the wall, and was over in a twinkling. Beyond lay a stretch of open ground, and across that the old man was running nimbly, with Will some distance behind. Thank you.